Okay, I've got something delicious for you. A new in-depth report by a media platform in Korea called Dealsight or Dealsight is challenging the official story behind HYBE Chairman Bang Si-hyuk's alleged fraudulent trading case. Okay, nowadays in the Korean media, headlines are claiming deception and secret deals, right? But the latest analysis by this platform, Dealsight, reveals some key omissions from the regulators' announcements. And by regulators, we're talking about the Securities and Futures Commissions (SFC) and the announcement that they made on July 16th, which we have talked about in my previous video. Okay. So in this video that you're watching, I will break down some key observations that Dealsight has made. All right, and I know, like in general, my international viewers and subscribers write comments after watching the full video, which I really appreciate. Unlike some of the Korean viewers who make their own arguments, write their comments even before watching the video. I know it because YouTube analytics show the data. And I really appreciate you, taking the full information before voicing your opinions. But for this one, I would like to suggest once again that feel free to, add to the discussions after, watching the full context explanations before, raising your opinions. Okay? So, because there are some information that you might not have known before. Although, spoiler alert, we have already talked about much of what to be discussed last year, because it turns out Hive has clearly explained themselves. Although the K media does not necessarily pay attention to what they say or include Hive's arguments in their reports. Okay, so let's start here. So this is Dealsight's self-introduction, and the summary is that it is a specialized financial media outlet that focuses on capital markets, corporate financing, and institutional investing. So I'm trying to explain why this media agency might be significant and worth paying attention to. And unlike general news sites, it tracks the entire life cycle of a company's financial journey from startup to IPO and beyond, while reporting on like ECM, DCM, and M&As and private equity activity. And their mission is to cut through media noise and help readers understand the real flow of capital that drives economic change. So what sets them apart is that they're not writing for clickbait or mass audiences. But for people who want in-depth financial insight, from individual investors to market professionals. And according to them, their editorial team consists of veteran capital markets reporters aiming to correct the information asymmetry that often leaves retail investors confused or misinformed. And they try to build a healthier investing culture by offering verified and contextual reporting. Okay, so the reason they're notable, I think, is because most Korean media outlets tend to copy, like for example, in this case, regulatory press releases or recycle company statements without much analysis, right? But according to them, Dealsight stands out as one of the few outlets offering original insider-level financial journalism. And when a report comes from them, it's often the product of deeper, sourcing and market context. Something especially rare in high-profile controversies like the HYBE Bang Si-hyuk case. Although I'm sure they might have their own biases and stuff. But yeah, and also when they release articles like this, it's initially open for their subscribers who pay money, and before they open it for the general public. Okay, so which is also pretty interesting. All right, so let's read. And let me translate it for you. The title of the article is, "Was the SFC's referral of Bang Si-hyuk overreach? Key evidence missing raising concerns. 증선위, 방시혁 고발 무리수였나, 핵심 증거 없어, 논란. And again, SFC is the Securities and Futures Commission that has made an announcement on July 16th about how they refer the case to prosecution, the 방시혁 case to prosecution. Okay. Now, the article starts with this diagram that they got from the SFC's website, official press release. And let me briefly go through this for you. So here's an overview of the alleged unfair trading case. All right, so the flow of events goes. Existing shareholders of Company A are led to believe the IPO will be delayed and sell their shares. And here, Company A is Hive or Big Hit. And secondly, a planned private equity fund, PEF, involving Company A, Hive executives, establishes an SPC, which is a special purpose company right here. All right, number 3. The SPC acquires shares of Company A, Hive, or Big Hit. 4. The major shareholders, that is Bang Si-hyuk, enters into a shareholder agreement with the SPC, securing 30% of any future sale profits. 5. Former executives invest in the PEF and receive profits under the label of performance-based compensation. And next, finally, the profits are distributed to the major shareholder, Bang Si-hyuk, 30%, and to the fund operator and former executives. And this is the diagram that SFC provided in their press release. And the deal site included that in their own article. All right, so here we go. Once again, the title is, was the SFC's referral of Bang Si-hyuk overreach? Key evidence missing, raising concerns. Or this is controversial. 논란, that's the word that they use in their title. All right. By a journalist named Kim Kyu-hee of Deal Site. The Securities and Futures Commission's SFC under the Financial Services Commission has referred HYBE Chairman Bang Si-hyuk to the prosecution on charges of engaging in fraudulent, unfair trading. However, several discrepancies between the SFC's findings and the narrative previously reported in the media are raising controversy. Notably, a key piece of evidence related to a designated audit request, long seen as proof of premeditated IPO planning, was omitted, and some unfavorable clauses in Bang Si-hyuk's shareholder agreement were also left out. Okay, so omission and just being left out, fueling skepticism in the market. That's how they started the article. All right. So the article opens by what? Positioning itself against the dominant media framing, right? And they are claiming that the Securities and Futures Commission, SFC's referral of Bang Si-hyuk to the prosecution contains some critical omissions. It flags that what had previously been portrayed as clear-cut fraud now seems far murkier. So from the very first paragraph, the article casts doubt, not on Bang Si-hyuk's actions directly, but rather on the SFC's process and consistency, which is a pretty savvy move that shifts, scrutiny to the regulator themselves. Okay. Next paragraph. According to investment banking IB industry sources on July 18th, the SFC held a regular meeting on July 16th and voted to refer Bang Si-hyuk to the prosecution for alleged violations of the Capital Markets Act. The complaint also includes 3 individuals, including a former Hive executive, here referred to as Mr. A. All right. And then, they included this diagram. What's drawing attention in the IB community is how the framing of the case against Bang Si-hyuk has shifted. Previously, media reports suggested that Bang Si-hyuk had told existing financial investors, FIs, that there were no IPO plans. 기업 공개 계획이 없다. Okay, that's what he allegedly said to the existing financial investors, according to lots of media reports. Okay, so Bang Si-hyuk right here allegedly told the existing investors that there are no IPO plans, while secretly selling their shares to a private equity fund set up by a close associate, and later benefited from profits after Hive went public, or Big Hit went public. All right, and yes, that is true. That's the what most Korean media outlets have tried to say. Like for example, 한국경제, Korea Economic Daily, right here. Oh, sorry, where's it? In the reports that they released in May, the one I highlighted in orange, IPO, there were no IPO plans. That's what Bang Si-hyuk said to existing shareholders in 2019. And same thing with this article, also reported by 한국경제, specifically a journalist named Cha Jun-ho. You know how I highlighted his name in orange, right? And I also highlighted the phrase 계획 없다, no plans or no IPO plans. In this particular article, they mentioned it 4 times, including in the title. And speaking of which, the journalist Cha Jun-ho allegedly has some connections with Min Jin, because he was the one of the journalists who wrote this particular article, exclusive piece, back in April of last year, which included the original copy, the photo of an original copy of the shareholder agreement between Min Jin and Hive, which he could not have had access to unless Min Jin or her party sent it to him. Okay? Right. Now, next. However, the Dealside article says, the SFC's latest conclusion is less direct. It states that Bang Si-hyuk misled shareholders into thinking the IPO will be delayed. So, is no IPO plans versus IPO will be delayed. Okay? The article says, this is notably softer than the earlier framing, which claimed Bang Si-hyuk had explicitly lied about there being no IPO plans. All right, so let's go back to the press release by the SFC, the institution. They said this, right here. A사, 최대 주주 및 전 임원 등은 the largest shareholder and former executives of Company A, meaning Bang Si-hyuk, and former executives of Big Hit, or Hive, in an effort to profit by selling shares after the IPO, deceived existing shareholders during the pre-IPO period by making it seem as if the listing would be delayed, even though the company was actively preparing for the IPO. As a result, they induced the shareholders to sell their shares to a special purpose company, SPC, set up by a private equity fund involving Company A's executives. Okay? So, here's a shift in accusation language that the deal site is noting. That previously, Bang Si-hyuk was said to have explicitly lied to investors by saying no IPO plans. But now, based on SFC's wording, he made it seem like an IPO will be delayed. And even then, this is according to who? SFC's. Okay? So, this is a significant walk back. Like no plans is a categorical falsehood, whereas delay is an impression. Okay? So, this media agency, Deal Sites, spotlights this softening as evidence that the accusation is no longer as airtight as originally reported by Korean media agencies, including 한국경제. Okay? Right here. That and maybe, maybe acknowledging practical realities of IPO prep. And within the IB community, investment banking, attention isn't just on the referral. It's on how dramatically the language and framing have shifted from what the media, especially Korean Economic Daily, 한국경제, had led the public to believe. Because, like I said, for months, 한국경제 aggressively framed the case as one of outright deception. That Bang Si-hyuk flatly told existing financial investors that there were no IPO plans. 계획이 없다. Right here. 기업 공개 계획이 없다. No IPO plans. While covertly selling their shares to a private equity fund tied to a close associate and personally benefiting from the listing that followed. And this "he lied and cashed out" narrative fueled media headlines and public outrage. But the actual conclusion disclosed by the SFC is significantly more nuanced. You know what I'm saying? That Bang Si-hyuk misled shareholders into thinking the IPO would be delayed. And that's a notable softening, according to Deal Site. It abandons the claim of categorical falsehood, no IPO plans, and instead describes an impression which could have arisen naturally from the uncertainty of IPO timelines, especially in 2019 when Hive's listing was far from guaranteed due to external risk like BTS military enlistment. I mean, that event alone, later after IPO, made the stock price plummet. And this distinction between there's no IPO versus it might not happen soon is not just, semantic. It's legally and ethically decisive. And yet, major outlets like 한국경제 built their reporting on the former, no IPO plans, driving the public narrative toward presumed guilt. You know what I'm saying? The SFC, by walking that language back, has quietly undercut the strongest version of the media's claim. A fact that's gone largely unacknowledged in follow-up reporting. So, if the regulator itself is no longer alleging that Bang Si-hyuk lied, but merely that his actions may have created a certain impression, it raises this critical question, and that is, was the media overreaching from the very beginning, whether intentionally or not? Or did they shape public sentiment far ahead of the facts? We will discuss later on again. But let's keep going with the article. All right. Industry insiders interpret this as an implicit acknowledgement of the realistic difficulties that come with IPO planning. In reality, IPOs require long preparation periods and are often delayed, paused, or canceled due to market conditions. Many companies with ambitious plans never pass preliminary review stages. For this reason, it's typical for company executives to avoid making definitive statements about IPO timelines to investors. Hive, then Big Hit Entertainment, in 2019 was facing major uncertainty, including criticism of being a one-trick BTS company and the looming issue of BTS military enlistment. Given those risks, the IPO was far from guaranteed. In fact, Bang Si-hyuk reportedly told investors not that the company had no plans, but rather that it had not finalized any plans. That distinction raises questions about the fairness of the SFC's conclusion. All right. So the point that the other side is making is that IPO timing is never guaranteed. And this is something that I have discussed before. I think, both in English and in Korean. I have emphasized the hindsight bias. Now, people believe that Big Hit going public is so obvious. Look how successful BTS has become. But this article contextualizes that IPOs are uncertain by nature, with numerous moving parts like regulatory reviews, market conditions, internal strategy shifts. So it's normal for CEOs to speak cautiously about listing timelines, even to investors. So by normalizing Bang Si-hyuk's communication as industry standard behavior, the article neutralizes the accusation that he was being intentionally deceptive. And I just want to add by saying that, sorry, let me drink some water. So here's an article from 2018, December, with a title, Big Hit Entertainment of BTS, will they go public next year? And then they noted some of the risk. For example, after explaining that BTS is going larger and larger, they are too dependent on BTS and the valuation is too high, okay? And then how their IPO is being delayed forever, okay? And again, it's all about the hindsight bias. Korea did not even consider BTS as to be successful group until I don't know, like whenever there's a discussion of the reasons why BTS became successful, I always think about this particular interview of G-Dragon in JTBC youth program. Okay, so at the time, this was from 2015, and the host, JTBC host Son Seok-ki, asked G-Dragon a question like, how's Big Bang, his group, differentiated from other groups? And this was when Big Bang had a comeback with their Made album, MADE, Bang Bang Bang, Loser, the album where those tracks were included. And by the way, I used to be a big fan of both G-Dragon and Big Bang, and which is a group that BTS members themselves really respect a lot. Although international listeners have very different opinions about that group, and I have my own theory of how BTS made it like super globally while Big Bang did not. This is a separate matter. But why am I? Oh yes. So at the time, the JTBC's question was, how are you guys different from EXO, which is SM's biggest boy group to date? And then G-Dragon explains that it's because we write our own songs or something. And why am I bringing this up? Because at the time, 2015, BTS was out of the discussion. They were not even considering them to be, wants to be successful group. But then their growth was dramatic from then on. 2017, they got the Billboard Music Awards for the first time as a K-pop group. And then in 2 years, so that was 2015, 2017, that's when they won the Billboard Music Awards. And then 2 years later, 2019, they won again at the Billboard Music Awards. 2020, that's when Dynamite happened. And then right after they became the number one on Billboard 100 chart, Big Hit went into fully into the IPO mode. Okay, so it's all about the hindsight bias. Nobody knew, at least in Korea, or I'll just say, not many people knew that BTS would become this successful. So it makes sense that Bang Si-hyuk at the time was being cautious about the whole IPO discussions, Because again, going public ain't easy. It's not easy. Now, let's continue on with the article. Adding to the controversy. This is interesting. Adding to the controversy, a key detail. The request for a designated auditor, 지정감사 신청, was omitted from the SFC's decision. Okay? That was nowhere to be found in this press release. All right? Previously, the deal site notes, previously, this had been cited as a smoking gun, indicating Bang Si-hyuk's covert IPO preparations, since requesting a designated auditor is a prerequisite in the IPO process. But it has since emerged that the request was initiated at the suggestion of the existing FIs themselves. 그러나 실제로는 지정감사 신청이 기존 FI들의 요청으로 이루어졌다는 사실이 드러나면서. And that has led some to speculate whether the SFC deliberately left that detail out. Existing shareholders. That the request of what? For a designated auditor was initiated at the suggestion of the existing financial investors themselves. Okay? And this is crucial. One of the most widely cited pieces of quote-unquote evidence in early media coverage, or still, especially by Korean Economic Daily, 한국경제, was that Hive had appointed, or Big Hit, had appointed a designated auditor in 2019, 지정감사, IPO 지정감사, which is a mandatory step in the IPO process. Articles repeatedly emphasized, like Hive signed with EY Hanyoung as designated auditor in November 2019. A designated auditor must be requested with documents showing IPO intent. Hive told investors that there were no IPO plans, but told regulators otherwise. Okay, so what you're looking at is articles released by 한국경제 in May of this year, May 28th. Both of which were released May 28th by the same journalist. 차준호, 최석철 and 차준호. And 차준호, again, was the one who wrote this article that included the original copy of the shareholder agreement between Hive and Minijin. And interestingly, the other journalist who wrote this article, Ha Ji-eun, was the one who wrote this article, saying, revealing the identity of an artist that New Jeans mentioned during their guerrilla live stream on YouTube. How one of the staff of a certain artist group in Hive said, "Ignore her," referring to Hani. Like told a certain group to ignore her. And during the guerrilla live stream, New Jeans did not mention the group name, probably intentionally. But out of nowhere, the next day, 한국경제's 하지연 기자, who wrote this article with 차준호 기자, saying that it turns out it is Islet, everyone. I just wanted to hammer this home, this weird connection between 한국경제 journalists and New Jeans / Minijin. And I just want to add, there's sometimes I want to say to my viewers and subscribers that not everything has something to do with Minijin, like New Jeans or Kakao or SM or China Money, but this case, the Bang Si-hyuk case, feels more and more familiar. The whole pattern, the media pattern, and it smells very much like the media tactics that a certain woman is good at and enjoy doing. And I'll just leave it at that. But in general, I'm not really a conspiracy theorist, and I don't really appreciate that. But I just want to say that this case feels more and more familiar, which I can talk more about later. All right. So where was I? All right. So that this quote-unquote evidence was something that 한국경제, Korea Economic Daily, tried to hammer home. This double game framing, became central to how outlets like 한국경제 pushed the idea that Bang Si-hyuk was acting deceptively, saying one thing to investors, doing another behind the scenes. Okay, and the term 지정감사, right here, IPO 지정감사, was used over and over to paint this as irrefutable evidence of hidden IPO planning, because 지정감사, a designated auditor, appointing a designated auditor is a mandatory step in the IPO process. But now, according to Dealsight's reporting, that very argument is being dismantled because the designated auditor request was made at the request of the existing financial investors, not initiated by Bang Si-hyuk himself. And the SFC omitted this issue entirely from its official referral decision, suggesting they either couldn't prove intent or that the process was standard and unremarkable. And this omission raises some legitimate questions. Was the regulator's initial case weaker than media assumed? Or did they deliberately leave out procedural context that would soften or neutralize the, quote-unquote, smoking gun? And this matters because if the designated auditor is, equal to a secret IPO plan logic, this logic, doesn't hold up, then much of the the outrage that is going on, moral outrage that is going on in Korea against Bang Si-hyuk, built on the idea of deception, is undermined. It reveals how the media, especially 한국경제, may have amplified a procedural formality into a narrative weapon, perhaps on purpose. And it raises concerns about selective framing by both media and potentially the SFC. Okay? Now, let's go back to the article, the final paragraph. Another point of contention is the SFC's selective presentation of the shareholder agreement terms. The Commission emphasized the clause under which Bang Si-hyuk would receive 30% of profits post-IPO, but omitted other clauses that exposed Bang Si-hyuk to significant downside risk. For instance, under a putback option proposed by the FIs, financial investors, Bang Si-hyuk could have been liable for hundreds of billions of won in losses if the IPO had failed. Critics argue that by focusing only on the upside and ignoring the potential risk he took on, the SFC's judgment appears biased. Okay, and the last sentence is this. An IB, industry banking industry source, commented, "Every investment involves both risk and reward. The fact that the SFC's announcement omitted circumstances that were clearly unfavorable to Bang is puzzling. 의아하다 is puzzling. And once again, it's about its hindsight bias. The SFC emphasized the clause where Bang Si-hyuk would receive 30% of post-IPO gains, but what was omitted was the put option clause. If the IPO failed, Bang will be liable for massive losses. And this shifts the structure from this greedy insider play to a risk-sharing deal. And Dealsight doesn't say that Bang Si-hyuk is innocent, but it just says that SFC is being one-sided. And this was actually something that we have discussed last year on my channel, talking about a specific article in November titled Bang Si-hyuk's 400 billion Korean won side agreement. Is it legally problematic? 5 key points explained. Okay, and one of the key points, in fact, the first one was this. Why did Bang Si-hyuk personally receive 400 billion won? And let me read you because this is pretty important. One of the most striking aspects of this case is that Bang Si-hyuk personally received 400 billion in his own name. Typically, if a major shareholder wants to cash out during an IPO, they do so by selling existing shares, old stock. When Hive, then Bicket Entertainment, prepared for its IPO, there was speculation about whether Bang Si-hyuk would sell some of his shares to take profits. But in the end, the company chose to go with a full new share issuance. And that is, no old shares were sold by insiders. So how did Bang Si-hyuk end up personally receiving 400 billion won? Stig Investment, which is a private equity firm, invested 103.9 billion Korean won in Hive in 2018, followed by Easton PE and New Main Equity Partners, which jointly invested 125 billion Korean won in 2019. Along with these investments, they signed a shareholder agreement with Bang Si-hyuk that was essentially a give and take arrangement. If the IPO failed, Bang Si-hyuk would buy back their shares. So that is, he would offer a put option. If the IPO succeeded, the funds agreed to share a portion of their profits with Bang Si-hyuk. At the time, the article notes, BTS had not yet become the global powerhouse it is today. Their reputation was growing. Songs like DNA were charting on Billboard, but uncertainties remained, including the unresolved issue of military enlistments. According to reports, the PE funds expected to hold their shares for 5 to 6 years, assuming a long-term horizon. It's common in such high-risk long-term investments to include mechanisms to protect the investor's principal. But Bang Si-hyuk reportedly took on the put option burden personally, not wanting to impose it on the company. In return for shielding the investors from downside risk, the funds agreed that if they made outsized gains, Bang Si-hyuk would receive 30% of the upside. In other words, since Bang Si-hyuk personally guaranteed the downside, he was also entitled to share in the upside. A Stig Investment representative said, "We agreed not to disclose the detailed terms of the contract, but when we filed for IPO preliminary review and submitted the securities registration statement, we consulted multiple law firms and were assured there were no procedural issues." It is also reported that the National Pension Service, 국민연금, which was a major limited partner LP in the Stig fund, was fully aware of the contract details at the time. Nevertheless, the fund moved forward with acquiring the Hive stake, judging that there were no legal problems with the agreement. And once again, this article was written and released last year, and I have specifically talked about this on my channel. And Dealsight is highlighting the fact that the SFC has not included that portion in their press release, which, according to the IB industry source, is quite puzzling, them being this biased, okay, and one-sided. So overall, and then at the end, Dealsight in this article included this diagram, which I have translated right here. So it's a summary of this article. Allegations raised in the market. IPO disclosure. Bang Si-hyuk allegedly declared there are no IPO plans. Designated audit request. Allegedly pursued IPO preparations behind investors' backs after submitting the request. About put option. Profited significantly by securing 30% of IPO gains through side agreements. Hive's response or Hive statement. With IPO disclosure, Bang stated no official IPO plans had been finalized, according to Hive. Okay, with designated audit request was initiated by existing investors, not Bang Si-hyuk himself. About the put option, a risk mitigation clause in case the IPO failed. Bang would have taken on significant financial losses. Now, SFC announcement that was made on July 16th. With IPO disclosure, Bang Si-hyuk misled existing investors into thinking the IPO would be delayed, not that there were no plans. Okay, about designated order request, no mention in the official materials in the press release. When it comes to put option, again, no mention in the official materials. All right, so the reason why I believe that this report is crucial is that it provides crucial context that completely reframes how Bang Si-hyuk's 400 billion won payout should be understood, and it exposes, the selective framing in both the SFC's referral and much of the media coverage. First of all, it wasn't like a secret windfall. This wasn't Bang Si-hyuk secretly grabbing 400 billion won behind shareholders' backs. It was a result of a formal, legally vetted earnout structure tied to risk sharing. And he didn't sell HYBE shares to cash out. He structured a contractual performance bonus in exchange for taking on significant downside risk. Bang Si-hyuk shouldered the downside alone. This isn't a case of a corporate executive exploiting the company for personal gain. Bang Si-hyuk intentionally took the put option burden on himself to avoid putting the company at risk. At least according to Hive. Okay, and that's not typical behavior for someone engaging in fraudulent, unfair trading. And the contract was reviewed by multiple law firms during IPO preparations. So going back to this article, right? So the National Pension Service, Korea's largest institutional investor, knew the terms and did not object. This destroys the notion that the agreement was some sort of hidden or backroom deal. And in light of all this, the SFC's decision to highlight only the profit-sharing clause that Bang Si-hyuk gets 30% while omitting the put option and downside protection he provided looks selective at best. And I gotta say misleading at worst, you know what I'm saying? And it crafts this narrative of greed while ignoring the risk that Bang Si-hyuk absorbed on behalf of investors. All right. So yeah, this article that we have already talked about last year shows that Bang Si-hyuk's 400 billion won gain was not unearned or underhanded. It was rather conditional and risk-bound and legally vetted. And that's a very different story from the one told by media outlets, leading to scandal. And the SFC's omission of these details raises some serious concerns about regulatory bias or political timing, and highlights why readers and investors must look beyond headlines. And speaking of political timing, yeah, that's what the media, Korean media, has been trying to do, especially this, old, familiar journalist named Lee Sun-myung of Sports Kyongyang, trying to put the photos of Bang Si-hyuk and the current president side by side, how Bang Si-hyuk could be the main target of the Lee Jae-myung administration, and how this could be the fall of Bang Si-hyuk. All right, so going back to the deal site article, the core argument, to summarize, is that the issue here isn't just what Bang Si-hyuk did. It's how the regulators are framing it and what they're choosing to leave out. And this reframes the case from did Bang Si-hyuk commit fraud to is the case, the state's case strong or fair or properly communicated, And again, the deal side article clearly speaks to institutional investors and IB professionals, investment banking professionals, legal observers, and high information retail investors. It's not necessarily for the general public. So it avoids clickbait language and steers clear of like emotional framing and rather offers procedural nuance, which the general public is often not exposed to. So this matters because in a media landscape where most outlets either parrot like government press releases or lean into sensationalism, Dealside is like providing balance without fully defending Bang Si-hyuk, you know what I'm saying, and demanding like rigor from regulatory bodies, and it's helping sophisticated readers and watchers and viewers like you guys understand the legal uncertainty and reputational risk involved. So yeah, I believe that although much of what the article talked about has been already discussed on my channel, even before this year, it's quite different from the usual K media and valuable because it challenges the official narrative. Most Korean outlets simply echoed, like I said, the SFC's press release and framed Bang Si-hyuk as essentially guilty. Dealside, on the other hand, scrutinizes the internal logic and omissions of the SFC judgment, pointing out what wasn't included and why that matters. Okay? And rather than fueling outrage or leaning into moral judgment, they broke down what the delay versus no IPO plan language means in investor relations. And they noted that IPOs are rarely certain even when pursued, and explains how statements to financial investors are often intentionally cautious due to market volatility. And this is the kind of technical and market-oriented analysis that's usually missing from headline-driven media. And they didn't just question Bang Si-hyuk's actions, they questioned the fairness and framing by the SFC. Why was the designated auditor issue omitted? And why highlight profit sharing clauses but leave out the risk clauses like the put option? And why is this case? This is me, actually, the question that I like to ask. Why is this case surfacing now, 4 years later, and framed politically? Yeah, and this pushes the conversation beyond did he do it, did Bang Si-hyuk do it, into is this being fairly handled and reported, right? And like I said, as clearly outlined in their mission and vision, Dealside is not a general news outlet. It's a capital markets intelligence platform built specifically for readers who operate inside the financial ecosystem. So it focuses on the flow of capital behind the corporate growth, like tracing how funds move through venture capital, private equity, IPOs, debt markets, and M&A activity. So its reporting is grounded in the realities of how companies and institutional investors, not casual readers, to how they navigate risk, reputation, and return, right? So unlike mainstream outlets chasing viral headlines, Dealside rather speaks to professionals like investment bankers, experts, and institutional analysts and policy observers. So yeah, this gives its journalism a rather measured and technical and investor-focused tone, one that explains how systems work and not just what sounds scandalous. Okay, so yeah, I think this article was notable because it raises questions rather than jumping to conclusions, and it does so from a place of financial literacy and capital markets expertise. So it reads like a internal memo written by someone in investment banking, not a viral news item. So yeah, that makes it much more credible and useful, especially for readers like or viewers like you guys, who are trying to make sense of the real mechanics behind the scandal. All right. Now, before we wrap up, I think it might be worth paying attention to Hive's reaction after the SFC made this announcement again. Mind you, I have already talked about this in my previous video. So this is from the article released on July 16, after the news broke out about what the SFC did and said. So wait, was it after? Yeah. So Bang Si-hyuk skips SFC hearing despite risk of referral. Actually, this was before the announcement or the press release was made. Okay, so it says the FSC, so Financial Services Commission, is set to make a final decision on the fraudulent trading allegations against HYBE Chairman Bang Si-hyuk. It is reported that Bang Si-hyuk has decided not to attend the hearing offered by authorities to explain his side. On July 16th, this is confusing. FSC's Securities and Futures Commission, SFC, so SFC is a sub-body under FSC, will hold a regular meeting to review the case. On July 7th, the Capital Markets Review Subcommittee, which is an advisory body to the SFC, recommended that Bang Si-hyuk be referred to the prosecution for violating the Capital Markets Act. Hive has maintained that it followed all legal procedures. It previously stated, "We have fully cooperated with the financial authorities and the police by submitting detailed explanations and related documents. We will continue to clarify that the IPO was conducted in accordance with laws and regulations, even if it takes time." Hive also confirmed that Bang Si-hyuk had attended an earlier FSS investigation and said he sincerely addressed all the questions posed by the authorities. Hive also confirmed that Bang Si-hyuk had attended an earlier yes, so that's what I just said. And here's an article the next day. And this was when the press release was made. All right. Bang Si-hyuk skips hearing on fraudulent trading. Can he reverse the charges at prosecution? So it said, HYBE Chairman Bang Si-hyuk has officially been referred to prosecution on allegations of fraudulent trading. Though he appeared before the FSS last month, he notably skipped the SFC hearing where he had the opportunity to present his side. Many see this as a strategic move to shift focus to the legal battle ahead. To date, Bang Si-hyuk himself has not publicly commented on the case, but Hive issued a statement on his behalf. They said, "It is regrettable that the explanation provided by our largest shareholder during the FSS investigation, clarifying that he did not pursue personal gain through the IPO, was not accepted. We respect the financial authorities' decision, but will actively address the allegations during the prosecution process to regain the trust of the market and our stakeholders." Now, analysts believe, the article says, Bang Si-hyuk's absence at the SFC hearing stems from the belief that the authorities had already made up their minds. With the referral inevitable, Bang Si-hyuk may have chosen to save his arguments for the court rather than engage in what could be a symbolic hearing. Currently stating in the United States, Bang Si-hyuk is said to be preparing for a legal defense. Okay, now when I first read that, I was like, this is pretty interesting. And Hive, well, at least in his statements, sounds kind of very frustrated, you know? So first of all, it's notable that Bang Si-hyuk skipped the hearing. Well, so the SFC giving him an opportunity with a hearing, that itself is kind of interesting. And the fact that he refused was also interesting. And the statement that Hive made after SFC made a decision was also very notable, you know, because Hive appears and sounds deeply frustrated. And there are multiple signs, you know, like the tone shift. Their public statements are increasingly getting like sharply worded, yet carefully diplomatic. They're saying it is regrettable, 안타깝다, okay, indicates dissatisfaction. And they said, despite sincerely explaining, it was not accepted. This implies that they feel ignored or railroaded, you know. And they said, we respect the decision, but will actively explain. So this is a polite way of saying that we disagree, and we're not done, you know. So this is not exactly a company that thinks the matter is closed. Rather, this sounds like a company preparing for a fight. and doing it on legal, not PR grounds, which what Hive has been all about since Lee Jae-sang became the CEO last year, the current CEO, I believe. You know how he said during a shareholder meeting that I attended that Hive will continue to stand firm in a calm manner. 차분하게. So kind of feels like they don't care about the noises anymore. Or rather, they're taking cautious stance with their wording and the statements and how they deal with the media, it seems. Okay? And skipping the SFC hearing was strategic, now it seems, because Bang Si-hyuk's refusal to attend wasn't out of avoidance. It's a calculated signal. By refusing to engage in what they may see as a bias or performative process, they're betting that the prosecution phase offers better due process, or they're preserving arguments for a courtroom battle where they can present full contracts and context and legal precedents. Okay. Now, last but not least, before I finally wrap up this video, I feel like these articles from last year, which we briefly discussed on my channel, show that Hive has already explained and defended and documented this whole issue in depth, which might help explain their current tone and choices this year. All right. So this one is from November 29th, titled HYBE Underwriters Knew About Bang Si-hyuk's Earnout Deal, Legal Review Found No Issues, released by Money Today, November 29, 2004. It said, HYBE explained the shareholder agreements as follows. Chairman Bang accepted institutional investors' put option, stock buyback clause to help early investors recover their capital. To reduce the burden on the company, he personally proposed to repurchase the shares. HYBE added, later, the new investors suggested adding an earnout clause. If the stock price rose after the IPO and they sold their shares, they would share a portion of the profits with Bang. Fortunately, the stock rose post-IPO and profits were realized. HYBE also stated that Bang Si-hyuk used the proceeds from the earnout clause to participate in a 445.6 billion capital increase in June 2021, fully subscribing to his allocated 154.8 billion won. A large portion of the profits from the earnout clause were returned to the company through this capital injection, HYBE said. Here's an article from the same day, November 29th, 2004. Kim In-jang, HYBE's legal advisor, commented, there was no financial loss to ordinary shareholders or the company, and the contract didn't lead to any change in controlling shareholding. The major shareholders' put option would expire upon IPO, so we determined it was not a required disclosure item. An executive at one of the underwriting securities firms added, disclosure standards were different back then. Since the clause didn't affect the IPO pricing, we decided it didn't need to be reported. Here's an article from December 4th, 2004. The contract was not included in either the preliminary IPO screening report submitted to the Korea Exchange or the securities registration statements filed with the Financial Supervisory Service. But both the lead underwriters and major law firms reviewed the relevant domestic and international laws and concluded the contract didn't need to be disclosed. HYBE's IPO was co-managed by NH Investment and Securities, Korea Investments and Securities, and JP Morgan, who was the lead, and Media Asset Securities, who was the co-lead. And legal advisors included Kim In-jang, Bae Kim and Lee, BKL, and Yul Chun and Lee Ko, who are the major law firms in Korea. HYBE spokesperson said, we reviewed the matter thoroughly with major law firms, including U.S. standards, and were advised that disclosure wasn't necessary. The underwriters also reviewed the deal and confirmed there were no legal violations. They added again that Bang Si-hyuk used 154.8 billion won from his earnout profits to reinvest in the company via the capital increase. Okay, so yeah, what have you learned? First, Bang Si-hyuk took on risk to protect the company. Hive's repeated message is this: Bang Si-hyuk absorbed risk personally by put option, and not to enrich himself secretly, but to help early investors exit safely, at least according to Hive. And he returned a significant chunk of the upside to the company via capital injection. In other words, the earnout clause wasn't exploitative. It was compensation for personal financial risk and resulted in no harm to Hive or its shareholders. And the deal was reviewed by Korea's top institutions. Hive can credibly claim that top-tier law firms like Kim and Jong and underwriters like NH and JP Morgan all vetted the contract and judged that it legal and non-material in the context of IPO disclosure rules at the time. And this matters because it reframes the narrative. It wasn't some hidden deal done in secret. It was a documented agreement reviewed by multiple professional entities. And given that this issue was publicly explained and defended late last year, with transparent numbers and clear legal reasoning, Hive may see the SFC's renewed scrutiny and the media's breathless framing as frustratingly performative. And thus, maybe this is why Hive refused to attend the SFC hearing, and Bang Si-hyuk and his team are instead preparing a stronger case for the prosecution phase, where legal facts will take precedence. So this is not silence. Rather, it feels like strategy. Okay? And from a PR lens, Hive has already, gone on record in detail and with numbers. They may now feel that additional statements only invite more bad faith interpretations or selective framing, as seen in recent headlines, suggesting Bang Si-hyuk secretly pocketed 400 billion won. Instead, they seem to be, letting their 2024 record speak and shifting from PR defense to legal offense, maybe, So they have moved from explaining to contesting, it seems like. So, but we'll have to see. And I just wanted to bring up this image one more time. It's a very famous image of how the media could frame a victim into an offender and an offender into a victim, right? And we have seen this last year. How just a little, something all of a sudden turns into this risk and controversy. A simple photo of, or a footage of Bang Si-hyuk being seen walking with a lady in LA became this whole controversy that could threaten the future of Hive or something. Owner risk right here, everybody. Sell your shares. And how this convertible bonds issue produced all these headlines trying to make it seem like Hive is about to fall apart, running out of money. I'm not going to explain this whole thing, how ridiculous these headlines were. If you're interested, go search for the video. I think it includes a key term like convertible bond or CB. I have already explained in depth. And this is when I felt like maybe these guys, the journalists, are trying to make all the retail investors to sell their shares in Hive so they can, someone else, like large fish, big fish, and institutional investors can invest early. And now this whole pattern feels very familiar and smells very familiar. All right, and I'll leave it at that. If there are more updates, I'll make follow-up videos. If you have any information or opinions that you want to add, as always, feel free to fill in the gaps. When you do so, let's stay positive, respectful, and classy. Thank you guys. Peace and love. Bye-bye.